Have you ever thought about the fact that you might not have existed? After all, there's no reason to think you had to exist. If circumstances had been different, you might never have been born. The only reason any of us exists is that we were caused to exist. We're dependent on something other than ourselves. Our existence is contingent. But that's not the case with God. He exists independently of anything else. That is to say, God is self-existent. This attribute of self-existence is sometimes called aseity, from the Latin a se, which means from itself. So we're saying God exists from himself. John writes in his Gospel, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made." Here, John talks about the uncreated Word, which was God, that existed in the beginning. By contrast, everything else has come into being through the creative power of the Word. There is a distinction drawn here between God, the uncreated Creator, and everything else which depends for its existence upon God and His Word. God is uniquely set apart as self-existent and uncreated. Thus, Scripture indicates that God is the sole ultimate reality, the creator of all things other than himself. God's aseity confronts a serious challenge from one of the oldest and most persistent philosophical doctrines, Platonism, which holds that in addition to concrete objects like people and planets, there also exist separate realms of abstract objects like numbers, propositions, and properties. Platonists hold that these abstract objects are every bit as real as the familiar physical objects of our daily experience, and they exist necessarily. For it is inconceivable that there should exist, for example, a possible world where there are no numbers or propositions. Moreover, and this is the crucial point, Platonists assert that abstract objects are self-existent and uncreated, just like God. Thus, God is no longer the sole ultimate reality, but is reduced to but one self-existent being among many. How do Christian theists respond to the challenge of Platonism? Fortunately, a wide range of alternatives to Platonism is available. One such alternative, neutralism, points out that we often talk about things as if they were objects, even though we know they're not. For example, when I say the price of the ticket is $10, that statement is true, even though I don't think for a moment that there's an object called a price floating around somewhere. If this is the case, then it seems that using words for abstract objects in true statements does not commit us to believing that such objects actually exist. Even if I make a more direct statement, like deep differences exist between Democrats and Republicans, I'm still not committing myself to the actual existence of objects called differences. In the same way, neutralism allows us to affirm mathematical truths like there is a number between 2 and 4 without committing ourselves to the actual existence of numbers. Another alternative to Platonism is pretense theory, which builds on the idea that people don't stop playing make-believe when they grow up. In fact, all fictions, drama, film, literature, and art are, in effect, adult games of make-believe. What is crucial to fiction is not that the story is false. No, what makes something fictional is that we are supposed to imagine that it's true. So, for example, the adventures of Sherlock Holmes are fictional, not primarily because the brilliant detective never existed, but because the author wants us to imagine that he did exist. Pretense theory considers mathematical discourse to be a kind of make-believe. We are merely pretending or imagining that mathematical objects like numbers exist, even though they are no more real than fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes. So the challenge of Platonism is far from insuperable. Those of us who are committed to God's aseity can choose these or a number of other alternatives when responding to Platonists. Moreover, God is not just self-existent, as great as that is, but also necessarily existent. God doesn't just happen to exist. Rather, since God is the greatest conceivable being, his attributes aren't just pretty good, they're as great as they can conceivably be. It follows that God's existence isn't merely contingent like ours. It's necessary, because necessary existence is greater than contingent existence. We can also talk about this using possible worlds terminology. Possible worlds are simply ways the world could be. Now, if God is the greatest conceivable being, he doesn't exist in merely one or a few possible worlds. He exists in every possible world, wholly independent of anything else. There is no possible world in which God does not exist. So God exists by a necessity of his own nature. Just as it belongs to God's nature to be all-knowing and all-loving and all-powerful, so too it belongs to his nature to exist. That's why it's meaningless to ask, who made God? That's like asking, why is it that all bachelors are unmarried? It belongs to the very concept of a bachelor to be unmarried. Similarly, it belongs to the very concept of God to exist. He cannot not exist. We can sum all this up by saying God is the necessarily existing, uncreated creator of all reality outside himself. Because God is a necessary, self-existent being, we can trust him wholly with our lives, for from him and through him and to him are all things.